Hello, this is Slow Night Sleepy Stories. The story I would like to share with you tonight is the short story, The Scoundrel by Kim You-jeong. The opening of the work paints a peaceful and fragrant portrait of a mountain village in the peak of autumn. Yet beneath that quiet scenery lies the cold and weary reality of the common people of that time. This is an ironic and sorrowful tale of two brothers who, crushed by a harsh reality, were forced to steal the very rice they had labored to grow themselves. Tonight I invite you to dim the light of your screen, gently close your eyes, and lean only on the sound of my voice. Let us journey together onto that desolate mountain pass where Eung-chil and Eung-o once walked on a chilly autumn night. Please, listen closely. Manmubang, the Scoundrel. In the mountain valley, autumn had ripened deep. Giant old pines were packed tightly together. They swayed gently, wearing heavy canopies like Buddhist hats. Between them, acorns, cherries, wild pears, and brown leaves were splashed with vibrant colors. A clear spring trickled, soaking the grass. Two hares sat leisurely facing each other, lapping at the water. Occasionally, as if startled awake, the fallen leaves shivered with a rustle. A crisp mountain breeze blew. Lovely wild chrysanthemums danced brightly in its embrace. A fragrant earthy steam pierced the nose along with the scent of soil. This one is coral milky cap, this one is the smell of rotting leaves, and this one is pine mushroom. No, it is the scent of peppermint hidden inside the thorny vines. Eung-chil strolls around aimlessly with his hands clasped behind his back. Moving his legs leisurely, he weaves between this tree and that. His nose flares and contracts in the air, sniffing repeatedly. Huff, huff. Reaching the foot of a crooked pine tree, he stops. This time he brings his nose close to the ground and circles around once, brushing past the greens. Aha, here it is! The soil rose up in a small mound covered by rotting pine needles. Reprimanding his fingers, he gently and carefully brushes it away. Indeed, a lovely pine mushroom. You rascal, you could have come out just a bit more. He plucks it, holds it behind his back, and saunters off again. Occasionally he lets out a deep yawn. Each time he flings his arms wide, looks up at the distant sky, and stretches lazily. It is the peak of the busy harvest season. No farmer would have thought of coming out for a pine mushroom distraction. But he had nothing he absolutely had to do. If he felt like it, he did it. If not, that was that. It wasn't that he had plenty to eat. On the contrary, he had no land to farm, no wife, and no children. As for a room, it was a borrowed side room at best, and his sleep was always cramped and restless. Even this morning, a friend came by and asked him to help thrash rice, but he refused. Rather than working for a few pennies, he preferred the pine mushrooms. After all, whom does all the grain spread across this 3,000-li land belong to? Isn't it the property of whoever eats it first? Why work like a madman when there's so much grain piled up that you could get caught eating it? One should just worry about how to eat without getting caught. True, he had been caught 3 times and had his life twisted in prison. But in the end, one's own portion sitting on one's own table could just as easily lead to getting caught. The higher he went, the thicker the brush became. Wild grapes, hardy kiwis, arrowroot, and various unknown weeds. These tangled up and down, rarely yielding a path. He stuck only to the grassy trails. He moved carefully, minding his torn trousers that bared his thighs. In his hand were 7 pine mushrooms woven together with arrowroot. He peered around every old pine tree. Like a hunting dog, he sniffed deeply with his nose. Snuff, snuff. This looked like a mushroom, that looked like a mushroom. He couldn't distinguish which was the real prize. In a spot where rabbit droppings were piled, a single brown leaf fell. Lifting the leaf gently, the head of a pine mushroom poked through. It seemed quite large. Overjoyed, he plopped down on his knees before it. He held out both hands over it, spreading all 10 fingers. Slowly, he brushed away the dirt. A mushroom the size of a fist appeared. "Hey, you're a big one." He placed it on his palm and grinned, staring at it for a long while. In a gloomy corner, a rock stood sheer like a wall. From the arrowroot leaves clinging to its midsection, water dripped down, trickle, trickle. They called it medicinal water from rotting ginseng. He sat on a rock and let out another yawn. Staying up all night for a useless gambling session had left him terribly weary. Warm, sunlight filtered through the forest. A squirrel dropped a pine cone and a pretty wagtail flitted before him. From the village came the clamor of threshing. Voices shouted in excitement, drowned out by the vibrating sound of the threshing machines echoing in the air. Vroom, vroom. From the mountainside opposite, the melancholy songs of young cowards floated over. Looking out at the panorama of the village buried in the mountains, he squinted and let out yet another long yawn. Why all these yawns? Come to think of it, his stomach had been empty since last night. Suddenly, he pulled out the largest and most delicious-looking one from his bundle of mushrooms. Eung-chil rubbed the mushroom in the water and greedily took a large bite out of its wide head. His broad mouth moved as he chewed. The taste was smooth as if his tongue would melt, and wonderfully fragrant. To think he couldn't eat such a magnificent thing before, only being able to smack his lips. Suddenly, old memories spun at the tip of his tongue. Tasting such a thing was a very recent occurrence for him. It was beyond his station. He used to settle for just getting a good whiff of the scent. Even if he wandered the mountains, he often failed to pick any, and on the rare occasion someone picked one, they wouldn't let him touch it for fear of damaging it, taking it straight home to bury it away. If they were lucky enough to fill a bundle, they would immediately take it to the market to sell. After 2 or 3 days of hard labor, they might get 40 cents at best, or 25 if they were unlucky. It was fine to return over the dark mountain pass with a few liters of millet, thinking of a wife waiting for dinner, but looking at that miserable state, it was beyond pitiful. Infuriated by the thought that he couldn't even eat this, he pulled out another one and crunched into it, dirt and all, without even washing it. But the others were likely no different. Though this valley was the home of pine mushrooms, there was probably hardly anyone who ate even one a year. Humph, rotten heads! Distorting his broad face, he scoffed as if for others to hear. Rotten was his way of looking down on someone for being foolish. Tucking the remaining stump of the mushroom proudly into his mouth, he chewed while mixing it with a belch. With 2 mushrooms in his stomach, he no longer found it interesting to eat more. He wished for something more substantial. Rice cakes, noodles, horse meat, dog meat, pork, or perhaps beef? Well, since he was desperate, he sat there idly, imagining eating all sorts of things. His eyes began to wander. Some kind of hen was circling in front of a grave below the millet patch. Seeing her clucking and circling, she was likely looking for a place to lay an egg. He lifted his rear from the rock. Pretending not to see by looking away toward the low sky, he circled wide toward the hen. But when he reached the grave, he turned around and shouted, "Shoo, shoo, shoo! Where do you think you're going? Shoo!" He spread his arms and gave chase. As she was driven toward the mountain top, the hen flurried in confusion, not knowing where to go. Darting this way and that, she only grew more frantic with her clucking. But it took less than a few minutes for her neck to be snapped by those rough fists in a rocky crevice. He found a secluded spot in the forest. After skinning the hen completely, he pulled her legs apart, and her innards spilled through her side. He scraped them out, lumped them with the skin, and buried them in the dirt. Now that he had meat, he naturally thought of makgeolli. It would be perfect to boil this up and gulp down a bowl of it. Damn it. Eung-chil's meat was the kind that couldn't quite make it to the tavern. Regardless, could he not eat meat first and then drink? He brought the hen's breast to his mouth and began tearing into it. The chewy texture was quite tasty. After finishing the breast, the thighs, and the rump, and getting through about half, the taste somehow diminished. In the end, food needs seasoning. Tossing it into the bushes, he sauntered down. Just as he was emerging from the pine forest toward the fire-fallow field, someone suddenly called from behind, "Hey, isn't that Eung-chil?" Turning his head, he saw Song-pal, the blacksmith, a man of small stature, hurrying over the ridge. He seemed to have urgent business, for he rushed up and said, "Do you know the rice in the Eung-o field is gone?" Eung-chil's heart sank. At this busy time, no farmer would laboriously go all the way to Eung-o, and it was highly suspicious that he was telling him of all people about the missing rice. Setting aside small talk, Eung-chil asked, "Why did you go to Eung-o?" He stared boldly into the man's eyes, but Song-pal, showing no sign of fear, replied with a blustering tone, "Oh, I just happened to pass by, that's all. What a scoundrel." Eung-chil had wandered far and wide, but he never filled his belly by betraying a comrade. He didn't do such base things. His face flushed and fire sparked in his eyes. Just happened to pass by? It had been over a month since Eung-chil arrived in this village. He was sick of it by now and desperately wanted to leave, but he was hesitating because of his younger brother's situation. Though no one invited him, he had many places to go. Wherever his feet landed, be it mountains, fields, or the seaside, that was his destination. When night fell, he would just collapse where he was. A stranger's mill, a shed, a riverbank, or a marketplace. Of course, if he were lucky, he might spend a comfortable night on a straw mat. In this way, he had traveled through the secluded mountain valleys of Gangwon province, crossing this ridge and that, touring almost everywhere. Staying in one corner made his chest feel so tight it was painful. Yet, it wasn't that Eung-chil was born with a wanderer's fate. 5 years ago, he had a loving wife, a son, and a house. In those days, would he have ever spent a single day away from home? Every night, sitting with his wife, he would rack his brain and wonder how to grow their livelihood, but there was no clever solution. It seemed they farmed diligently, but in the end, all that remained were debts to others. If this continued, they would eventually face humiliation. One night, he woke his wife, who was snoring loudly. He told her to go outside and count how many household goods they had. He himself ground ink on a whetstone. The newspaper pasted on the wall was yellowed with soot. On it he wrote down every item his wife called out. 3 jars, 2 hoes, 1 sickle, right down to bowls, chopsticks, and 3 bundles of straw. Then he listed the names of the people he had borrowed money from. He noted the amounts under each name, and a little space away, he wrote in Hangul, "This is all I own. I have no way to repay the 54 won, so as a sinner, I am fleeing. Do not fight among yourselves. Please discuss and distribute this fairly." Leaving this statement on the wall, he locked the doors from the inside, and the family of 3 slipped out through a hole under the fence. This was the first day Eung-chil changed his fate. The couple wandered and begged for food. The wife begged for the husband, and the husband begged for the wife. Then one night, the wife's face looked very sad. The blizzard nipped at their skin. They were huddling in a corner of a crumbling watermill, wrapped in straw bags, as she nursed the baby. She turned her head and said, "Dear." When he asked why, she said, "If we keep on like this, we'll only suffer, and more importantly, we'll kill the baby. So let's part ways." Indeed, those were sensible words. 2 people with nothing but the clothes on their backs wouldn't fare any better together. It would be easier for them to part and beg on their own. He readily agreed. As his wife suggested, if she remarried and raised the baby well, and if they both stayed healthy, they meet again if fate allowed. After lying side by side on the ground with his wife one last time, he shook himself off and stood up as dawn broke. A falcon's fate must be Eung-chil's fate. He could walk down the road with a grand burp, for there was nothing to hinder him. No worries about weeding the fields, no worries about paying taxes, no worries about debts, no worries about a wife, or worries about starving. Stripped of everything, it was the finest of fates. If he wanted to eat, pigs, chickens, or dogs were always nearby, and money too. However, the police station kept an eye on him. They were always calling him in, which was a nuisance. Whenever an incident occurred in any village he was in, he was the first to be hauled in, because he was a habitual offender, first for gambling, then for theft, and then again for theft and theft. But his visit to his younger brother this time was not because he was destitute or looking for work. His brother was his only kin, and he missed him from time to time as they hadn't seen each other for a long while. Thus he had come all this way only to stumble upon trouble. If the rice in the field was still standing until now, no sane person would believe it. Eung-o had not yet harvested the rice in the Eung-goge field. Of course, Eung-o should be the one to harvest it. Anyone who heard about it would suspect his brother Eung-chil first. Then Eung-chil would have to bear all the responsibility alone. Eung-o was a sincere farmer. At 31, he was considered mature and was hailed as a model youth in the village. Yet, he wouldn't harvest the rice. Others had all gathered theirs and were even threshing, but he wouldn't even think of harvesting. Whether it was the landlord or Kim Champan, who had lent him grain at high interest, they visited frequently to urge him to harvest. You should thresh it quickly and pay what you owe. To which his only reply, spat out consistently, was, "My wife is dying. What does the rice matter?" True, his wife was on the brink of death, so he might have lacked time, but since they were in a position where they couldn't afford medicine, he really should have threshed the rice. Then why didn't he? Anyone who had threshed rice before the landlord's gate with Eung-o last year wouldn't need to ask. It should have been a joy to harvest the rice he had nurtured as carefully as an only child through a year of anxiety. From the crack of dawn, he worked without feeling weary, shouting, "Heave, heave." But after threshing until dark and paying the rent to the landlord, the interest on the grain, and the various fees, all that remained was the cold sweat running down his back. It was more than sad. It was infinitely shameful. Returning home, dangling an empty A-frame carrier while his comrades watched was truly a humiliating sight. Unable to bear it any longer, Eung-o had shed tears. As if that weren't enough, this year was a poor harvest. The rice had withered in the easterly winds and rain. If they harvested this, not only would there be nothing left to eat, but they wouldn't even be able to cover their debts. To hell with it. Let them come and take it, or do as they please. He had no choice but to leave it. If word got out that he had harvested, the creditors would swarm in. Eung-chil's crime was evident here as well. He should have just stayed quiet, but in the heat of the moment, it was Eung-chil who jumped in and slapped the landlord's face. He hadn't intended to do that at first. Having tasted the waters of many places, he was a reasonably sensible loafer. He met the landlord and discussed it frankly in a very reasonable tone. He suggested that since this year's harvest was a partial failure, the rent should be reduced. But the landlord simply shook his head without a word. Eung-chil said, "If you're going to be like this, since I need to at least make up for a year's labor, I'll set fire to that field." But the landlord remained silent and unmoved. From the landlord's perspective, he could easily harvest the rice himself, but he feared that if he set a bad precedent, every tenant might behave that way, so he was only pressuring him outwardly. In reality, he didn't much care whether he had that bit of rice or not. Sensing that motive, Eung-chil exploded in anger, which was fine, but before he knew it, his fist had flown out. With the rice in such a problematic state, a strange occurrence like a ghostly prank happened. In other words, the rice disappeared. Moreover, leaving aside the diseased and withered chaff, only the full grains had been plucked. Estimating by the area, it was likely at least 5 bushels. Eung-chil discovered this early in the morning while strolling by the field and was aghast. He wondered who was trying to make things difficult. Since the field was tucked away in the mountains, it seemed no one had seen it yet. Once the rumor spread through the village, he would be suspected in some way and would surely suffer for it. Eung-chil was busy pondering, regardless of the pine mushrooms. He considered several people he might suspect, but there was no evidence to point to anyone. In the end, it was Eung-chil who thought that it must be either Jae-song or Song-pal. The enemies met on a single log bridge. Eung-chil, sensing his guess was correct, stared into Song-pal's eyes as if he were about to start trouble right then and there. Song-pal had been chatteringly excited, but he was stunned by that glare. His face went pale as he stared back, and then he said, "Hey, why are you so angry? I just saw it while passing by, so I'm just telling you, that's all." He stammered, unable to manage the aftermath. "Who's angry?" Eung-chil put more strength into his tensed body and said, "I'm asking why you went to Eung-o. I was on my way back from playing and just happened to." "Playing? Is that a place for playing?" "Look, why are you asking so much? Am I someone who can't go to Seoul, let alone Eung-o?" Song-pal, appearing frustrated, let out a long sigh through his nose. There was no need to ask further. Song-pal was quite a character himself, having once been to prison for stealing a village elder's pot or something. Although they weren't close, the village reputation was that if you associated with him, you'd end up in trouble. Realizing that he himself was caught in that trap this time, Eung-chil said, "Of course, there's no reason you couldn't go to Eung-o." He retorted, "But as you know, unless there's a road or a village there, why would a sane person go to Eung-o to find something to eat?" "Of course, you probably went because you were bored," he said, pressing him to see his reaction. To this, there was no reply, and Song-pal just stared blankly. After a while, as if thinking of something, he pulled out a pack of Danpung cigarettes from his pocket. He first put one in his mouth, then offered another, saying, "Have a cigarette." He put on a very composed face. Song-pal was someone very keen on his own interests. Eung-chil thought he wasn't the type to offer a cigarette for no reason, but to make a fuss here would only be disadvantageous to his own position. That would be falling right into his hands, so he said, "Oh, why a cigarette suddenly?" He lightly shrugged it off and said, "Do you have a match?" He deliberately made him provide the light. When he thought of the malicious intent to shift the blame onto him and use him, he wanted to rush in and break the man's legs. But if he made a scene here, it would be like spitting while lying down. In the end, a thief is caught from behind, not threatened from the front. Fearful that rumors would spread in the village, he said, "Hey, whether you did it or I did it." He then patted him on the back as if being friendly and said, "Let's just keep this between us and not tell the village." When Song-pal looked startled and stared wide-eyed at these words, he laughed and said, "What? Does it matter if someone eats that much rice?" Song-pal, perhaps caught off guard, was speechless and just smacked his lips. "Don't tell a soul, you understand?" When he pressed again, the man finally hesitated and said, "Why would I say anything?" After a short pause, he added, "Why would I? Don't worry about that," and then slunk away. But it was a fact that he looked back twice to check this way as he walked to the ridge ahead. Eung-chil watched him and muttered, "Die, you scoundrel," under his breath. Even for a thief, trying to frame a fellow for one's own crime was absolutely against the code of honor. Regardless, wasn't Eung-o more pitiable? He would be devastated if he found out that after all his hard work, someone else had benefited. How can one trust a neighbor like this? Resolving that, if he had definite proof, he would finish the man off, Eung-chil spat and headed down the mountain. But judging by the man's behavior, he was a thief who hadn't even shed his amateurishness compared to Eung-chil. What kind of madman brings scissors to a rice paddy? An ignorant novice. If you're going to do that, you should go for the millet or sorghum stacks. If you sit inside them and snip away with scissors, you won't get caught. It's easier work, and you can take 2 or 3 sacks worth. If you wait for a chance and carry it home, that's it. But who takes rice from the field? If someone were that starved for rice, they should just work as a servant in someone's house, flatter the master for a month to gain trust, get some clothes, and then when everyone is asleep, shoulder a couple of rice sacks and be off. This guy doesn't even know the basics and is just making life miserable for others. He felt his flesh trembling with rage. But a petty thief like this would cling stubbornly unless caught red-handed. Tonight, he would stake out the place, catch the fellow, and break his shins. After eating, he nonchalantly gulped down a bowl of makgeolli and said, "Woo, it tastes much better now that it's autumn." He wiped his mouth with his fist and pulled 3 mushrooms from his bundle. Offering them to the withered hand of the tavern old woman, he said, "Here, have some pine mushrooms." He paid for his drink that way, but she said, "Oh, these pine mushrooms are quite something." She was acting slyly, pretending to be pleased but looking a bit disappointed. In her mind, even if they were 3 cents each, it only came to 9 cents. Eung-chil grew slightly angry and looked closely at her face. Why did those cheekbones protrude so awkwardly on her sunken face, and those toes peeking from under her skirt? If you looked closely, they were like a stork's ankles. Why keep this woman around instead of taking her away? The more he looked, the less there was to like. It wasn't just once or twice he'd eaten there. He had even mowed the grass near her fence once and received a bowl of wine. Why be so stingy? He gave her a sidelong glance, pulled out one more, and said, "Here, have another one." He tossed it to her and spat on the stepping stone. Only then did she seem satisfied, smiling as she said, "Oh my, what if you keep giving me these?" "What else? Just get fat," he retorted sharply, stood up, but then sat back down on the veranda as if remembering something. "But really, have you seen Song-pal lately?" "No, haven't seen him at all." "Doesn't he even come for a drink?" "He doesn't?" She muttered something to herself and looked suspicious, asking, "Why? Did something happen again?" "No, it's just been a long time." Eung-chil glossed over his words and looked away. It was already lunchtime, for the chickens were crowing loudly. The poplar trees by the field rustled, and their leaves fluttered and flew up into the sky. How long has Songpal lived in this village? Let me see, it was probably the autumn of the year before last. She took a long drag from her pipe and said, "But they say he's leaving again, going to his brother in Eung-chil, Eon or somewhere." She added that it was the right choice. What would he do here? Unless there's a lot of work at the blacksmith's, but he's just catching flies all day and night. It would be more comfortable for him to help his brother, who farms on a large scale, and just get fed. So he and his wife and children would probably leave soon. A farmer should just farm. I'll come back for a drink tomorrow. After a brief greeting, Eung-chil stood up again. Leaving the tavern, a refreshing breeze brushed against his collar. The jujubes on the embankment hung heavy. Winter would be here before long. He looked toward Eung-o's house and wondered if his wife had died in the meantime. Eung-o was sitting on the veranda. In the brazier before him, medicine was bubbling away. He sat staring at it vacantly. From the gloomy room came his wife's labored breathing. She made a seek, seek sound, and then with an "oh my," she coughed as if fainting. It seemed the phlegm was rising and causing her great distress. The weeds in the yard were tangled, having had no time to be pulled. From the roof where the earth was exposed, horseweed swayed. The wind occasionally visited and shook the brushwood gate. Each time the gate creaked mournfully, creak, creak. The neighbor's puppy was busy clattering in the kitchen, but there was only the leftover millet porridge he'd fed his wife in the morning. No, wait, her husband had scraped that clean too, so there were only the scraps stuck to the bowl. "Hey, it looks like it's all boiled down." Eung-chil said that medicine is useless if it boils down too much, so he should squeeze it out and feed it to her. The medicine was just the snake he'd caught behind the fence last night. But Eung-o either didn't hear or chose to ignore him, sitting silently without even lifting his head. "Here, taste some pine mushroom." Only when his brother reached out his hand did he finally look up, but he awkwardly scanned his brother's alcohol-flushed face. He took the mushrooms ungratefully and tossed them into the room, saying, "Eat this." Then he shouted, "What?" Since she couldn't be heard well, he frowned and said, What? Speak more clearly." But his wife only made hand gestures, and he couldn't tell what she was saying. Her voice was more like the sound of paper rubbing together. Even being close didn't help him hear it. Watching this, Eung-chil felt uneasy himself and said, "Doesn't she want to relieve herself? Then she should say so." The husband immediately grew irritated and stood up. It wasn't as if he'd only just realized his sick wife's voice was changing day by day. He carefully lifted the living corpse, withered to the bone from the floor, and carried her on his back. The ash pit was located at the head of the field outside the fence. It was a cave so low his head could be crushed. Cobwebs were tangled everywhere. Setting her down on the footstones, his wife huddled against the wall, and the husband stood guarding her, staring blankly. Watching this from afar, Eung-chil snorted unpleasantly and smacked his lips. It was because Eung-o's behavior was foolish and infuriating. Eung-chil likely knew why Eung-o had been acting strangely and avoiding him lately. Eung-o had worked as a servant for a full 3 years to win this wife. He never had a single drink he wanted so badly, and of course, he never bought a piece of the dog meat he'd craved. And every time he received his wages, he lent them out at high interest, using that as the down payment later. He'd gathered her with such thrift, yet in less than 2 years, things had come to this. But nobody knew what this disease was. He'd never once properly shown her to a doctor. Someone who claimed to know said it was a brain ailment and thus difficult. If they had money, whether it was a brain ailment or a plague wouldn't matter. But 3 days ago, when he ran out into the street and grabbed Eung-chil's arm, shouting, "Brother!" Eung-o seemed quite spare it. "What is it?" When Eung-chil turned around, the man hurriedly said there was no other way. There was only one thing left. Didn't an old man who commands mountain spirits come to the village the day before yesterday? That old man especially pitied Eung-o and said if he spent 15 won on a mountain ritual, she would be healed as if by magic. "Brother, can you always make money?" "That won't work. A ritual won't heal a sickness that should be healed by a ritual. He flatly refused, saying, "That's why I told you to leave your wife and follow me," and added, "They say a farmer's life is his own noose." But when his brother turned away without a word and went into the house, Eung-chil thought to himself that he'd said something unnecessary again. Eung-o carried his wife back and laid her in the room. The medicine had all boiled down. He would have to squeeze it before the fire died out. After waiting for it to cool, he held the medicine bowl to her mouth, and his wife gulped down that snake water without a word. Eung-chil sat vacantly in the yard. He thought that a person's life is indeed precious, but he couldn't understand why a thing like a woman could be so precious that it was hard to let go. "You know Songpal over there, right? Are you close to him?" I asked what his name is. "Why don't you answer?" Even when he shouted, his brother wouldn't answer and didn't even lift his head. Eung-chil just looked up at the sky and let out a long belch. The smell of alcohol should have pierced his nose, but only the scent of fresh kimchi lingered. He shouldn't have just gorged on free kimchi. He should have had one more drink. He stood up, tucked his pipe into his belt, and brushed the dirt from his rear. He thought about telling him the story of the stolen rice, but decided against it, thinking he was already in a bad mood and it would only hurt more. Better to catch the fellow first and then have a bit of fun. He stepped out of the gate. Seeing his brother's stifling life, he was reminded of his own stifling life, and his heart felt heavy. In such times, a radish is the best thing. Indeed, it was a truly merciful act of God to provide radishes. When feeling congested, chewing on one and feeling it go down with a crunch is good. He went into someone's radish field and pulled one up. A garak radish. Whoa, his luck was grand today. Tossing that aside, he pulled another and went down to the stream. After scrubbing it in the water, he bit off the tail and crunched into it. On the bank of the stream, a poplar tree stood tall and slender. Pebbles were gathered in clusters beneath it. Along the edges, the grass was thick. Eung-chil lay sprawled out, staring blankly at the village. That village, where the mountains surrounded it so tightly, it felt suffocating. Arirang, Arirang, crossing the Arirang Pass. The steam train whistles to leave. Holding my dear one, I shed tears. Arirang, crossing the Arirang Pass. Not knowing if I'll leave tomorrow or the day after. Why bother planting corn and potatoes? Crossing the Arirang. Humming this to himself, he suddenly missed Gangnam. He liked the leaping fresh fish, and he liked the waves crashing powerfully under the morning sun. Compared to that, this was a cramped corner. Yet even they, claiming to have farmed a bit, were shouting and making a fuss. But even in the midst of that, an indescribable loneliness lingered. It was a world away from the autumns of 30 years ago, when they brewed wine, clanged metal, and danced joyfully with their shoulders. Why was it that as autumn arrived, the countryside, which should be filled with joy, grew increasingly murderous? Thinking this way, the memory of a robber who killed someone with a sickle on a mountain path one night the year before last suddenly came to mind. A farmer killed another farmer who was returning from the market. Even if it had been a large sum, it was only 4 cents and 7 liters of sorghum. Moreover, to hide the evidence, he had peeled the skin off the victim's face and left it as mangled as a croaker's head. A truly monstrous butcher, a cruel rascal. For a measly 4 cents, if it were me, I would have felt pity and given him more money. Thinking that this fellow might be that kind of ruffian, he felt a chill down his spine and his hair stood on end. He had been delayed by taking care of his brother's farming in the meantime. Tonight he would break the man's legs, and tomorrow he would see about sauntering off. Pondering which mountain to cross, he began to snore softly. As night fell, all things drifted into a quiet sleep. In the dark blue sky, the mountain peaks rippled roughly, and the stars shone with blurry eyes. Then, as clouds gathered, it became a pitch-black abyss. In the center of the village, a harsh wind swirled mournfully, and occasionally the refreshing scent of mountain sand pierced the nose. Beneath the poplar trees at the northern foot of the mountain, a light flickered exceptionally brightly in the tavern. Let's play while we are young." The sound of a song floated out quietly and leisurely. They were likely drinking on credit, using the rice as security. Eung-chil silently stood up and went outside. And only after coming out did he say to his friend, so as not to be noticed, "I'll be back in a moment." "Where are you going?" The friend, not knowing the reason, stared blankly and said it was late, so he shouldn't go out but come back in and sleep. Since they had been chatting about this and that and he suddenly stood up, it seemed quite strange. "I'm going to the next village to buy a pack of tobacco." "I have tobacco here. Why buy more?" The friend stubbornly pulled a tobacco pouch from his pocket and showed it, saying, "Come back in and help me weave some straw mats." "Oh right, I forgot." Eung-chil scratched the back of his head with an apologetic face. Indeed, he had been asked to help with the mats for several days, but he'd been so preoccupied with gambling that he kept forgetting. He felt bad for staying and eating while doing nothing, but said, "I'll be back soon." He left his friend behind with that vague remark. But this friend was never one to rush him. As always, he said, "Well, have a safe trip." He only wished for his well-being. Eung-chil occasionally felt that everyone treated him with a certain respect, and his shoulders would swell with pride. Even someone he didn't know at all would yield after just a few words. If he told stories about his exploits, well, theft, really, and how he suffered in prison, they would open their eyes wide and say, "Oh my, how did you endure that?" And with a hint of surprise, they would ask, "So what happened to the money? Do you ever think about doing it again?" Compared to us farmers, that's a luxury life. They seemed somewhat envious. They also wanted to eat well and live like that, but lacking the means, they found some comfort just in hearing those stories. Eung-chil knew this well and busily told stories about how he'd shoved someone headfirst into a rice paddy and fled only to be caught and punished, saying, "You guys have a long way to go, a long way." When he talked big like that, they would nod silently, as if agreeing, and innocently buy him drinks and tobacco. But it seemed the person who stole the rice this time was looking down on Eung-chil. Thinking this way made Eung-chil even more indignant. With an ash wood club as his companion, he cut across the paddy path and headed up the mountain. It was a deep, dark, moonless night. The path was dark, and only the blurry surroundings shimmered before his eyes. To that field, it would be a good 7 ri. Leaving the entrance of this village, he crosses one ridge, then another. Between the next ridges, tucked against a densely forested mountainside, lay several patches of rice paddies. Eung-o's field was one of that. It was set so far back from the road it could hardly be seen. As long as no rumors had spread in the village, it was a stroke of luck that no one had seen it, but it must be Songpal's doing. Eung-chil crossed the first ridge by the public cemetery. When he reached the top of the next ridge, his legs faltered. On the high mountain valley to the left, a light flickered and then went out. It was too dim for an animal's eyes. Aha, they're here again. He veered off the path. Fumbling for branches, he climbed the large mountain. Rocks slipped and bruised the tops of his feet. Raspberry thorns stung his shins, and he crawled around the rocks. Near the very top of the mountain, there was a cave tucked between rocks that seemed to be huddling together. Weeds grew thick, blocking the entrance. Inside, 5 men sat in a circle, whispering. They were afraid the light might leak out. They kept the lamp low and huddled close to hide it. "Hurry up and play. I'm getting impatient." "Who's out this time?" "This guy, of course." "Shuffle again. Stop this nonsense." One of them grew angry, took the Huatu cards to shuffle them himself, and then started in surprise. He stared blankly at Eung-chil, who had suddenly burst in. They seemed to loathe Eung-chil's arrival. In such a petty gambling den, they wouldn't stand a chance if Eung-chil joined. They were deeply wary, but since offending him would be even worse, they said, "Oh, Eung-chil, come on in." One gave a forced smile, and another blustered, "I thought you might come. I was waiting for you. Anyway, let's play around." They were quite welcoming as they pulled him in by the hand. As Eung-chil stepped inside, he scanned the group with a fierce gaze. And wasn't Jae-song among them? Suspicion flared, for only 3 days ago, the man had told Eung-chil he had no food and asked for money. Thieves are often born in such gambling dens. Next to him sat Gi-ho. This fellow had sold his wife a few days ago. He'd said he would go to Yeongdong with that money to start a business, but here he was gambling. Did he think he could win with his skills? Another was Yeong-gu. He neglected his farming and was obsessed with gambling. He was the kind of person the village would ostracize for not even showing up for forced labor. And then there was a servant from someone's house, and a middle-aged man with a top knot, trying awkwardly to look dignified. Where did this creature come from? He'd never seen him before. Tsk, look at these guys. Eung-chil poked Gi-ho in the back and led him outside. Taking him to a secluded spot, he said, "Do you have any money?" When he turned around, the man looked wary and hesitated. "How would I have any money?" "I heard you parted with your wife. What did you do with all that money?" "Oh man, I paid off my debts." Gi-ho looked down, appearing very uncomfortable. He blocked one nostril with his right thumb and blew his nose, then added an unprompted excuse that he'd nearly died being pressured by debt this time, and scratched his back with a pipe. But Eung-chil thought to himself, "You rascal." Eung-chil narrowed his eyes and stared intently at Gi-ho, who then said, "I only have 4-1 left." He readily admitted it and added, "After paying off debts and this and that, it just vanished," and mumbled an awkward laugh to himself. Eung-chil said bluntly, "Lend me just 2-1. When the man didn't seem to listen, he couldn't help but shout, "We'll win and share it. Do you think I'll run off with it?" Only then did Gi-ho seem relieved. He fumbled inside his jacket and hesitantly pulled it out. Indeed, with Eung-chil's skills, there would be no loss. Even if he lacked talent and lost, he would likely just force it back anyway. "Let me play a round too." Eung-chil crawled into the cave with a swagger. A confident and satisfied smile played on his nose. Truly, nothing made him happier than gambling. Even when he was sad, holding Hwatu or Tujeon cards made his shoulder swell, and no matter how busy he was, he couldn't pass by a gambling den. He glanced at the other men and said, "Let's divide into 2 teams, shall we?" Eung-chil sat to one side with Jae-song and Yong-gu. Excitedly shuffling the cards, he slammed his hand down and said, "Since this is Tujeon, how shall we play these Hwatu cards? Nokpiki or Kyolgi? Let's just play for the Yakdan." The surroundings were chillingly quiet. Only the sound of sand rolling in the wind on the rocks could be heard. Occasionally, someone said, "There, take that," and the Hwatu cards clattered. Then it was as silent as the grave again. They were so obsessed with profit that there was no room for conversation. Fearing they might be cheated, their eyes were red as they glared at each other. You couldn't tell who was the winner and who was the loser. When Eung-chil tossed a card and proudly flipped over the bright moon in the empty mountain card, Yong-gu shouted angrily, "Why are you using tricks?" "What? What do you mean? Didn't you pull that card from under your sleeve?" "If you saw it, that's enough. Why get so angry?" Eung-chil smacked his lips awkwardly and said, "Then this round is a draw, right?" He tossed his cards on the ground and laughed heartily. Suddenly, from one side, a voice screamed, "You rascal, are you trying to kill me?" Everyone started and turned their gaze. The servant had slapped the face of the man with the top knot. He claimed the man had played a 5-point bush clover card upside down. But the truth was, he was furious about losing money. What kind of money was it? It was his wages, earned with blood through a year of labor, to lose all of it. "You rascal, you're a cheater. Give me the money." He grabbed the man by the collar and slapped him twice more. "Huh, look at this fellow, having no respect for his elders." The top-knot man straightened his back and gave a dignified command. It was a bit embarrassing to be slapped by someone young enough to be his son. He grew angry and looked as if he were about to start something, but then he just sat back down. If he touched someone who was desperate and furious, he would only lose in the end. He pretended to be above it, laughing. "Ha ha," and said, "I've never seen such an ill-mannered fellow." His scolding was fine, but then he suddenly collapsed with an "oh my." His forehead was cut and bleeding. A stone had flown from somewhere and split the skin of his forehead. Eung-chil left the cave with a grin. It would be a nuisance if something troublesome started for no reason. And he thought there would be about 101, but it seemed to be 40 at most. Who would sit there hoping for that? His winnings were 9-1 and 80 cents after accounting for his stake. He gave 5-1 to Gi-ho and said, "Here, that's more than half. You've lost your wife and lost your money. You're living the high life." He mocked him with a joke and then sauntered down into the forest. "Hey, I have a request." Jae-song followed him urgently, his voice dry, His request was obvious without asking. Having lost all his money to Eung-chil, he wanted some back. Eung-chil feigned ignorance and just kept walking. "Hey, Eung-chil, listen to me!" Then he grabbed him by the arm and begged for mercy. He'd said he tried to grow his money by selling 10 bushels of rice, but he lost all of it. He was starving and pleaded for a few cents to use as gambling capital. But if he'd threshed the rice, he should have just eaten it. Gambling was uncalled for. "Why did you do that?" Eung-chil turned around and shouted, but then he saw tears glistening in the man's eyes. He silently pulled out 2 won and gave it to him. Eung-chil is sitting on a rock, shivering with his arms folded. He was surrounded by trees on all sides. Their dark shapes looked like goblins. Every time the wind blew, they swayed eerily with a swish and whoosh. Sometimes a scream like someone's neck being cut echoed, "Screech! Screech!" He looked back occasionally. He thought nothing would happen, but something might jump out. The tutelary shrine was right behind him. A weasel or something caused some rocks to crumble with a rustle. That sound oddly crawled up his spine. It was a dark dream. Dew fell from the sky and soaked his collar. Between the fear and the cold, he could hardly endure it. The mountain spirit in the valley must be starving too, since no one would bring rice cakes to ask for a son. If this old man suddenly lunged in anger, after looking around again, he pulled out his pipe. Covering the flame with his palm, he took a deep puff. The rice paddy lay about 10 paces below. With all his concentration, he peered through the trees. But as he tried to tap out his pipe on the ground, the bushes moved strangely. A snake? If it's a September or October snake, a bite is the end. He moved his seat, covered his mouth with his hand, and stifled a yawn. It must have been over 2 hours. The fellow should have come by now, so what was going on? The rule of thumb for this kind of thing is to come once more before rumors spread. From lack of sleep, his eyes were gritty and closing on their own. He gritted his teeth and opened them wide, but then his waist felt heavy. His stomach was sour and his head was throbbing. A flame-like rage flared up and tightened his body. Even if I can't break this rascal's legs, he must be a fatherless bastard. The chickens crowed for the 3rd time. That sound coming from across the distant mountains was quite melancholy. Dark clouds were gathering as if bringing heavy rain. In fact, raindrops were already falling, drip, drip. Then a faint, ghost-like shadow flickered on the embankment. He sharpened his focus. It was definitely Songpal or Jae-sung, the one making him suffer like this. He gnashed his teeth and his shoulders heaved. He gripped his club tightly. Then he suddenly stood up and carefully circled down, clinging to the tree trunks. But as he reached the ditch, he faltered and stepped back. 2 wolves were crossing from this mountain to that, sauntering in a pair. Damn wolves, always causing trouble. Wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, he returned to his spot. What if this fellow was also like the robber from the year before last? Suddenly, an ominous premonition struck the back of his head. He tightened his collar and lit another pipe. Suddenly the wind grew stronger. The fierce wind blowing into the valley occasionally went mad. He shivered again. Why was autumn like this? He felt miserable thinking about staying up all night here, how much time had passed. Just as he stood up to move around and warm his body, he clearly saw a faint shadow approaching the field with his own eyes. And then fatigue and cold were out of the question. He leaned forward, braced himself, and stared with eyes wide and fierce. The white shadow suddenly disappeared into the darkness and didn't reappear. Only the sound of the wind whistled. Whoosh, whoosh. It became pitch black again. He must have surely entered the field to steal the rice. Like a fox, he would take advantage of the bad weather. An unprincipled, rotten scoundrel, especially when we're all starving together. Just you wait. He gnashed his teeth once more and gradually descended toward the field. Eung-chil moved close to the field and pressed his body against a pine tree. If he rushed in carelessly, he might suffer an unexpected blow. He waited for the thief to come out after stealing everything. He put all his strength into his body. After about an hour, the thief reappeared. He poked his head over the embankment, looked around, and then crawled out. His face was covered with a cloth, leaving only his eyes visible. With a bundle on his back, he hunched over and began to run. Then Eung-chil lunged out and shouted like a cannon, "You rascal! Are you stealing someone's rice?" The thief was so startled he rolled down the embankment. Eung-chil rushed in and first struck him across the waist. A piercing scream echoed, "Ah, ah!" Startled by the sound, he lifted the man's head and pulled off the mask. But he stood there dazed, perhaps because it was so utterly absurd. It was a terrifying silence. Only the mean wind played havoc in the air. After groaning for a while, the thief stood up and said, "Even you, brother, are going to make life this hard for me?" He glared and turned away. Then he began to sob uncontrollably. Leaving the bundle behind, he spat out defiantly, "I'm eating my own things. Who are you to say anything?" He staggered away toward the other side of the field. The older brother just stood there blankly, as if in a dream. After a while, he picked up the bundle with one hand. It was light, maybe only 5 or 6 kilograms. He truly couldn't understand the heart that would go to such lengths for this. He emptied the rice back into the field. Then he folded the black cloth, likely his wife's skirt. "I'm eating my own things." Indeed, those were the words. But the fate of having to steal one's own things was cruel, and the brother who had betrayed his older brother to do this was also a brother. "You rascal," he thought, and tears brushed his cheeks. He wiped his tears with his fist, and something flashed in his mind, the large eyes of a yellow ox. That plump ox tied every night in the backyard of a house 15 into the southern mountains. No matter how you looked at it, it would surely fetch 71. He hurriedly followed after his brother. He finally caught up with him near the cemetery. Tapping his brother on the back, he said, "Hey, I have a great plan. I'll get you the money you want. Just come with me for a moment." He spoke in a spirited tone to cheer him up. But his brother wouldn't open his mouth and stayed sulky. Moreover, he brushed off his brother's hand from his shoulder as if it were useless. And then he ran off. Seeing this, Eung-chil was utterly dumbfounded and breathless. "You rascal," he shouted in a rage. "And you call yourself my brother?" He immediately struck his brother across the buttocks with his club. His brother's body twisted and he slowly collapsed. He then struck his shins and back. He beat him until he couldn't stand. Disregarding appearances, he beat him until he wailed on the ground. He'd done it out of anger, but seeing the state he was in, he couldn't feel at ease. He spat and thought, "A man with a cursed fate is just like that." Then he lifted his collapsed brother onto his back and stood up. He wondered when he would ever grow up. He let out a deep sigh of frustration, and slowly and silently, he walked down the ridge. The brother who had to steal his own things, and the older brother who eventually carried that brother on his back down the mountain after a harsh beating. The sound of the cold autumn wind blowing over the hunched backs of the brothers seems to linger in the ears for a long time. Manmubang is an old word meaning a shameless and reckless person. But after listening to this story, you find yourself sighing deeply over the cruel weight of the era, wondering who the real Manmubang is. We hope that the deep sadness exhaled by the brothers in their harsh reality has provided you with a paradoxical comfort and a space for deep reflection in this quiet hour. We hope you let the lingering emotions of the night flow quietly in the comfortable stream of the podcast. Tonight, too, may your time be safe and peaceful. Good night.